You're listening to the Perth Property Show, Australia's only weekly property podcast by West Australian experts for West Australian listeners. Catch your latest episode every Monday at 7 a.m.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Perth Property Show. My name's Trent Fleskens, your host as always. This week we're speaking to James Cross, Thermal Energy Assessor and owner at Northern Aspect Energy Consultants. James, thanks for coming in, mate.
Thanks for having me.
Today we're going to have a conversation about something we haven't spoken about in 288 weeks on the podcast. That's over 5 years of talking about property investment, property ownership, construction, development, all those cool things about creating property. We've never spoken about NATHERS ratings, about energy ratings, Green Star ratings, all those assessments that fall under the sustainability energy efficiency space in new home construction. And probably at a time where it's really starting to come to the fore, not only in a political, ideological sense in Western Australia, but also just from homeowners who want to make sure that their houses are future-proofed in an environment that is obviously getting hotter. That's why we've got you in. I think it's going to be a really informative conversation for the spectrum of people that listen, from the CEOs all the way down to the first home buyers, to start to understand the difference between Green Star rating, NATHERS ratings, the construction code, when things are coming in, when they should have come in, and the difference between all the different stars and how we got there in the first place. James, let's have a chat about that. First thing I wanted to ask, what's the scene like in Western Australia? Are there many assessors in this space? Is it something that's, I assume, been a pretty growing industry in the last 20 years?
Yeah, it's still relatively small in comparison to other consultants. There's a core group of us who are accredited assessors, so we're all registered nationally. And then there's quite a large group who are not registered. You can't quantify those numbers because they're obviously not on a database anywhere. But as far as accredited assessors go, yeah, probably say be a couple of hundred in WA.
Yeah, wow. Okay. And the reason is, I guess, every new home is being assessed these days, right?
Yeah, new home, if you do an extension, add rooms on, you add windows in, every time you do something like that in the building code, it actually requires an energy assessment to get through building permit.
I assume this has come in over the last decade or two. When was the first time that you saw that regulation, that requirement come in for a new construction?
It's actually been in the code for a long time, but in 2011, we went from 5 stars to 6. So that's when it started to become a change where 5 stars was always quite easy to achieve, quite standard building specifications, and then once we went to 6 stars, that's when everyone started to stand up and take notice and realise that things have to change a little bit.
Now, when we think about the star rating, I think a lot of people, including myself, have been confused in history about the difference between NATHERS and Green Star and all these things. Can you lay out for us the different pathways here, and also there's the different definitions? What is the difference?
So NATHERS stands for National Housing Energy Rating Scheme. It's run by the federal government and it's run through the ABCB, so it's in the building code. So the Green Star is almost a voluntary assessment. You go through, I think it's HIA, you get your Green Star accreditation. So that's a voluntary thing where you can actually more all-encompassing rather than just NATHERS, which is essentially based on the thermal shell of the house. How well does your house maintain itself during summer and winter before you come home and start firing up the aircon or reverse cycle heating?
That's a really good way to look at it. I never thought of it that way. When you think about all the ways we try and ameliorate that issue, air conditioning, solar panels, all the things that people think, I'm being green, I'm being sustainable. But really when it comes down to it, what we're actually assessing is how hot is this kiln?
How well does this place look after itself?
Before we actually have to turn the aircon on. So if you step back a little bit there, you mentioned 5 stars, 6 stars. I know that we're supposed to be moving to 7 stars next year. It should have been last year. And the government has deferred that for us whilst we're in a bit of a housing crisis, as we've been speaking about for a while. Can you give us a bit of context as to what the difference is? When I think about 5 stars, anything, 5 out of 5, normally you're doing pretty well. 5-star hotels, you're in the best hotels in the world. It seems like we're sort of like the iPhone now, we're at 6 stars, 7 stars, next it will be the 7X or something like that, right? It just seems to keep going. It seems like the ballpark is changing as we have new technologies or new expectations or new requirements given how hot things are getting in WA. If we think about a 5-star house, what does that look like compared to, say, a 6-star versus a 7-star house?
So 5-star is really bare bones. This is where it does get confusing. It probably should have been 0. 5 should have been 0. That's where people do get confused. As you say, you buy a 6-star appliance, it's the best you can get. Whereas the 6-star house is really just a slight step up from the worst you can do. And then
so you can't do a 4-star or a 3-star?
The system actually goes down to 0, But to get compliance through the software, you have to get 6 in WA currently.
Okay, but what would it look like if I had a 2-star house, for example?
Glorified tent. Minimal insulation, you'd have the wrong orientation, you'd have probably too much glass. So that would really be a house that all year round you are...
It's a greenhouse, essentially.
Yeah, you're trying to heat or cool it with external appliances because you cannot live in that house.
Okay, so if we're at a 2-star house, which you just spoke about there, how's a 5-star house better than that? Is it simply just the things like its orientation and has fewer windows, for example?
The step from 2 to 5 was quite easy. Like, it really is a case of throwing in some ceiling insulation, getting close to a good orientation. It doesn't have to be perfect.
It's hard for people, right? If you buy a block of land, often most people wouldn't know what the right orientation is. I want a northern facing aspect. Well, which part of the house do I want that aspect with? It's always very confusing about, do I want it at the front, do I want it at the back, the side? I think people often end up, and especially in a crisis like this, just buying whatever's available on a nice street. You sort of just get stuck with it, don't you? A lot of the time you make do with what you've got in terms of your orientation.
Yeah, and a lot of people will pick their house rather than the block. People go, I love that house, how does it fit on my block? Whereas the step to 7 stars, which should be in May 25, the first key component is actually getting the right house on the right block. You get the orientation and the house right, you're probably 3/4 of the way to getting there. Ideally, you probably want an east-west block so that the long side is on the north.
Okay.
And that's where you try and orientate all your primary living spaces. So where you're going to spend the bulk of your time in that house, because I think one thing people forget in WA is, yes, summers are hot, but we still have winter. We're trying to create homes that are comfortable all year round. So the big sweeping 2-metre veranda is beautiful in summer, but in winter the house is freezing. So ideally that east-west block gives you that long north facing side where you can then design the house to get all your primary living areas with that winter sun.
As opposed to a 5-star where you've just put the house on the block, and if you're lucky there's a bit of northern aspect in the outdoor alfresco area or something like that.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that is often forgotten is what's happening around you. So if you are in a new estate, you've got to really consider what height your neighbours are going to be. You might have a 3-metre retaining wall on the north, so all of a sudden with a fence you've got nearly 5 metres blocking you from the sun. So that all comes into it as well. Like, don't just look at your house, look at what's going on around you.
So it's interesting the way you speak about the sun. Most people would think, oh, I'm trying to protect myself from the sun. Energy efficiency, we think about air conditioners. Any chance to stay away from that western heat, for example, that must be a good outcome. But what you're saying is that actually you want to expose yourself as much as you can to most of the sun so you aren't using all that energy heating it throughout winter.
Yeah, and then you can then work on summer. So put dead spaces on the west, like garage, bathroom, laundry, places like that. You put them on the west, so that you don't have bedrooms facing the afternoon sun. So you can, like, it is a fine balance, but you can get the house right. And then there is an optimal point where the northern eave is helping you in summer and not hindering you in winter. So you can, through the software we use, which is actually developed by CSIRO, we can give guidance as to basically what works.
When I think about trying to make my home energy efficient, I think about things like rainwater tanks, grey water tanks, solar panels, double glazing, triple glazing. How do all of those things factor into a NATHERS rating?
So basically none of that is part of the NATHERS rating. We're assessing the thermal shell of the house.
So there's none of the mitigants actually help with the star rating for NATHERS?
No, climate zone 1 and 2, which is basically the north end of the state, you do get a concession for either outdoor ceiling fans or solar panels, but we're dealing with areas that are just in the sun all year round. So
the Pilbara.
Yeah, so they get the concession there.
So when we're discussing NATHERS ratings here, we're really talking about the base design, the 2D design of the house. Even if my wife and I are sitting here going, oh, we'd really like to have the kids' rooms at the back and our room at the front and the outdoor area somewhere in between, you're saying that we're essentially getting to a point now where that's not going to be possible. You have to essentially design first for this NATHERS rating about maximizing efficiencies from that perspective, rather than simply our preference about how we want to live internally.
Yeah, very much so. And it's finding that right balance. And that's where traditionally in the market, energy assessments have been seen as red tape. But now,
I think a lot of people would feel like it is in a way. And I understand that there is also a growing community of people who are passionate about NATHERS ratings and about Green Star ratings and about energy efficiency and sustainability, and I think most homeowners would want that to be maximised in their house. But I think there's also a community of people who would see this as another thing restricting the way that they want to live.
I mean, the only restriction is how much money you want to spend. If you get the house design right, the orientation right, you can get to 7 stars for very bare minimal upgrades. You know, in most instances, you probably get there from 6 to 7 in less than $5,000, which in context of the cost of a home is a small percentage.
Let's say we have a block that is north-south facing. So obviously you spoke about east-west being the easiest one to get right. Just have your outdoor living areas on your north, and it sounds like you're in a good starting position. What if you don't have a block like that? What if you have a north-south facing block? Obviously the skinny side is on the north or the south. There's only so many places you can put your outdoor living area. Maybe, for example, there's a whole bunch of overshadowing to the north from a townhouse on the northern boundary straight away. What would you be doing there to get it to 7 stars in the first place? So there's just some positions or some situations where homeowners are just in a pickle and there's no way they could do that.
Yeah, there are some that are actually really difficult to get through. And
what's their solution?
Basically, it's just an incremental thing. So we'll target weak points. So you might have a small corridor or hallway, like a link hallway that's got a massive sliding door. So all of a sudden that little space is actually consuming a lot of your heating and cooling, which makes no sense because you've got a sliding door facing a wall. So some instances we'll say, look, let's just reduce some glass from there. And then we look at improving insulation in external walls. So you go walls, ceiling, roof, and then from there you basically start working through, you can upgrade glass. It doesn't have to be double glazing. You can just go for what they call low E, which is kind of a coated single glass.
Yep, I've used that on some of my developments as well. Can you explain that quickly as a little bit of a digression, the difference between low E glass and double glazing?
If you start with double glazing, the standard double glazing is just clear glass with 2 panes. So it still lets a fair amount of heat through from the sun. The low E actually lowers your solar heat gain, which is basically the sun coming through the house.
Double glazing is more of an acoustic protection rather than a sun protection, isn't it?
Yeah, so if you need the sun protection and you want double glazing, you go for a low E double glazing.
Okay.
So it's incremental steps, but it also depends on the house performance. If the house needs more winter sun, you typically don't go for like a darker or a grey low E because you want light.
So you may still go double glazing for noise maybe, but you wouldn't go with the low E because you actually want to get the most sun as possible in.
Yeah, and then if you've got lots of east-west windows, that's when you go for glass that basically stops a lot of that heat penetrating. So, and with low E itself, you do have different shades. Like there's a clear low E right down to bronze and green tones. The different values relate to how much sun gets through, basically.
Probably some different architectural feels as well if we're starting to bring some colours into there too.
Yeah, and you've got to be very conscious of that. You can't just go and specify green low E on one and clear on the other because the homeowner is going to see it.
Yeah, I get that. So it's really interesting to start chatting about things like low E glass, double glazing. Straight away, my brain goes to things like insulation. Now, most people think about insulation in the roof, and we think about that old reverse vacuum cleaner sending out all the insulation into a roof cavity. But we also start to see wall insulation as well. If you look at it, some of it looks like some pretty cheap product, but I also see that product where they're essentially plugging in a hose into the wall and then filling that cavity in with a foam product. Does this stuff help with NATHERS ratings?
Yeah, absolutely, because when you think about it, your walls are the biggest mass in the house. And double brick is very much a uniquely WA construction for the most part. And for years, everyone said you don't need insulation because double brick is amazing. But we know in the middle of summer, when you've had a few hot days, that heat's got through the brick and now it's trapped in the house. So insulating the walls makes perfect sense. And I actually built my house 12 years ago to a 7.5 star level. I've got insulation for all the cavity brickwork, which is kind of like a bubble wrap foil that sits between the 2 cavities.
Yep.
So what that does is create 2 reflective air spaces that essentially provide a barrier for the heat getting through. My house still only has your standard worst case 4mm glass, and I got to 7.5 stars, and it is noticeably different inside the house. In summer, we very rarely touch the aircon. Warranted, I live in Dunsborough, so we don't get those.
Life's pretty good down there.
Yeah, you don't get those really hot consecutive days, and you do get a sea breeze from east and west. But essentially, that same house with no cavity wall insulation, but adding double glazing, only got me to 6.4.
So what we're saying is that cavity wall insulation is probably one of the stronger players in this game. I've seen it in most of the developments I've had a look at over the last few years as standard these days. It probably started to come in about 3 or 4 years ago where it just became an expectation or a requirement in reaching those standards. But I also see a lot of builders using alternative methods other than assessing with the NATHERS rating. Can you explain how that happens and what the outcomes are? It seems like 1 second some people are using NATHERS ratings, others are using these alternative pathways, and I'm not sure what the actual outcome looks like and how you can compare them. Are they supposed to be like for like?
They are meant to be like for like. So that's the advice from the Building Commission is the performance-based solutions should give you equal to or similar outcome to what's in the building code, which is NATHERS, and there's another part of the code called deemed to satisfy, which is your bare minimum, worst case, like a tick box assessment. But that assessment is not suitable for cavity brick. It only works on stud frame or brick veneer, reverse veneer.
Which we don't see a lot of in Perth.
No, it's a very uncommon. Like, it's probably more common in country areas.
Certainly in the southwest. It's funny, the second you get south of Mandurah, there's no problem with a stud frame or a brick veneer house. Everyone thinks, oh, this is fantastic. The second you get north of Mandurah, it's second rate. It's interesting the perspective we have in WA.
That's where the market's been pushed.
It's marketing. It's definitely marketing.
Yeah, it's very good marketing. With cavity brick, you really are, the way the codes are written, your only option would be to go through the NATHERS system. Now, these performance solutions, basically they are a rework of the way the building code's written. They put your house through the software and see how it performs, and then you remodel a fictional house in the software based on the same design but to the minimum standard of the code, and you compare the two together, and if yours performs better then it passes. Now, on face value that sounds okay, but what's happening is they're reverse engineering fictional house to make it really poor. So the house that comes in maybe 4.5, 5 stars that you're building looks amazing next to a 2.3, 2.5 star house.
So the system's being gamed, do you think?
Absolutely. And at the halfway balance between what builders are pushing and what some companies are offering and saying, well, it's a competitive market. So if I want your business as an energy assessor, well, here you go, I can offer you this other solution. I think it's the consumer who is actually not aware.
Well, it's probably the consumer who's losing out, because a lot of people obviously expect that they're having to meet the 6-star ratings at the moment, 7-star next year. But if we're going with a performance rating, you're saying that something could be deemed to comply within a 6-star situation that we're in right now, might actually only pass at 3.5 if you did a NATHERS rating. Is that right?
Yeah, and I've actually done direct comparisons for some of my clients who've contacted me and said, I don't understand this report, I just wanted a star rating, and then you kind of give them the bad news. Okay, look, your house as built is around 4.5 stars.
When it was supposed to be 6.
Well, they assumed it was going to be 6, and I think it's a common misconception. It's not mandatory to build to 6 stars, but within the way the building code is written, it's the preferential option for cavity brick, and it really isn't that hard to get a house to 6.
What about 7? Will it be hard to get a house to 7?
Won't be too hard on your standard 4x2 project houses, but once you start building lightweight narrow lot homes or terrace housing, all those scenarios, it actually becomes quite difficult.
Because it's not in double brick? Is that where it starts to get tougher?
If you do a 2-story lightweight house, you lose all your thermal mass. So it does become tricky, because then you typically still have a lot of glass.
Does that then justify the marketing conception that a double brick home is a better home?
To a certain degree it does, but you can do timber frame and a concrete suspended floor if you're building a 2-story. So there are options out there. I actually did a display home for one of the builders. They're based over east, but they have a franchise here. And we got it to 9.2, and the whole house it's a 2-story timber frame house, but it actually has a concrete slab running through the middle.
You said 9.2. How high can it get? Is it out of 10?
The system caps out at 10. So 10 stars is the system saying your house will be comfortable all year round and you won't have to spend a cent.
So what's the difference between a property that's a 6-star rating now and that 9.2 house? What are the practical outcomes that mum and dad would recognise the difference in when they look at it and they walk through the front door?
The only real difference in this instance was the builder actually went with PVC, low E double glazing. Like PVC frames are probably, from a thermal perspective, they're the best you can get.
Because they're not metal and conductive.
Yeah.
So this is another thing that we're teasing out here, right? We've spoken about low E glass. We've spoken about insulation between cavity walls. We're now going to have a conversation about frames. Most of us are used to steel, aluminium frames. And what we know about those is that metal is conductive. Heat comes from the outside, it conducts inside and radiates. We probably don't realize that, but that is a big part of the whole passive house system, right? Is that one of the ways to improve your home is to have a thermal insulation between the outside part of your frame and the inside part of your frame. What you're saying is, well, actually, if you just use plastic, there's no conductivity there anyway, or minimal.
Yeah, and unlike timber, it doesn't have that maintenance issue that comes with it.
It's not going to rot.
And you can get thermally broken aluminium, which is essentially, they do put an insulation layer between the inside and outside part of the frame. Cost-wise, that's on par with the PVC anyway. So in this particular display home, the PVC windows set them apart.
When we think about plastic, though, we think over time things like plastic do start to warp and crack. Have they fixed that problem in the frame space?
All your plumbing materials are made of PVC. PVC windows have been used in Europe for a long time, and they do have the extremes. They have the minus temperatures, the snow, right through to, Germany will still have 35 plus days. So these countries actually have the same, if not stronger, fluctuations of temperature. So
something that's come up in my head right now is that obviously all the new houses we're building are being assessed. They've had to for the last decade or so. But what about houses that are 1960s, 70s, 80s? It makes me think about ANCAP ratings in cars compared to stuff from the 70s. I think most people wouldn't be comfortable driving around in a 1970 Holden Commodore. It just doesn't feel as safe, right? Even though it's built like a tank. But we know that all the newer cars, they have ratings. Newer houses obviously have to pass some standards, even if you're flagging with us that there are these workarounds being done by the performance-based consultants that everyone should be aware of. The question I want to ask is, how does the consumer be aware about what their second-hand house's rating would be? Would they contact a consultant and get an assessment done before making that offer, which, to be frank, would be hard in a market as tight as this, where 10 offers are coming in on the first Saturday? But is that really the only way we're going to know if we're buying a second-hand product in WA?
you can ask if they've got an energy rating certificate, but a lot of them won't.
Well, most people don't value it. If we're really frank, James, most people in WA are certainly knocking on the walls to see if they're double brick. They're even going in with a little electricity power plug testers. But they're probably not valuing or worried about, to their own demise probably, the energy rating of the second-hand home that they're buying. They're probably just aware it doesn't meet code and it's not a priority.
It's part of the process in Canberra already. They call it mandatory disclosure, where you have to provide the rating of the house when you sell it. Even if it's 1 star, you've got to advertise that. So what that does by proxy is then you go right back to the builder, who then goes, I don't want to be found out later on. Let's just do this properly. Let's push for a higher rating so that we get a better marketable product.
I think that's a really good idea. I think in the same way we buy a washing machine that has the energy and the water rating right there on the front, in the front left-hand corner of it, I don't see any downside to, before you have to sell your property, get a few $100 assessment done so that everyone's aware of the energy rating of your house. And now, a lot of people wouldn't want to be doing that, but if we actually started to make the community more aware about what these ratings were, it might, as you said, keep builders to account for the future, but also get sellers to possibly think about, hey, what could I do to actually bring this up to code to get a better value when I do sell, right? It might be seen as an investment.
Yeah, and I think that point will come. Climate is changing. We can't deny that. When you try and future-proof a home, you don't want it 6 stars. You want 7.5 upwards. So if you are buying and you know that if you've got a certificate, the actual NATHERS certificate is accredited, traceable all around Australia. If you've got that, it's a bit of peace of mind. Whereas if you've got, say, a performance report or no energy rating, don't have that there. So you've got that added expense of, if you don't have your house plans drawn up when you sell, you have to get it done. If they brought in mandatory disclosure, it probably would add a little bit of cost there, especially for older houses, but it does hold people to account for some of the houses that are being built now that are still well below what people expect. And I looked on the statistical data, and building permit approvals compared to NATHERS ratings, you had just over 50% in WA this last year. So that means 50% of the rest of the compliance through the energy pathway was either performance solutions or the deemed to satisfy, which is your bare minimum compliance. So that's still pretty much 50% of houses being built that were less than 6 stars. And then if you rewind to about 3 or 4 years ago, it was down to 15, 20% in WA.
So how has that happened? When we normally see red tapes getting tighter and tighter in Western Australia when it comes to building things, how are we going backwards in this situation?
I think a lot of it's just been driven by the cost of homes going up. So the builders don't want to spend any more. It's not sold to the clients very well. I think that's the big issue.
So what you're saying is that the development industry and the construction industry have all figured out, hey, we can just do performance-based assessments, and that's going to be far easier and far less punitive than doing NATHERS, so let's just do that. Is that essentially what's been happening?
Yeah, and slowly but surely a few councils are now starting to reject these reports. Or they're actually starting to scrutinise them more. May 25, the next version of the building code, there's actually it's a lot tighter the way it's written to do these types of reports, but they'll still happen. It just means there's more scrutiny. But essentially, yeah, it's a reworking of the way the building code's written, which is nothing set in stone the way it's written.
Well, I think it's really important to flag today, and I thank you for coming in, James, because I think it's one of those ones where we do all want to be on the same page about this. I think there's certainly merit in the idea of having all secondhand homes having to provide a NATHERS rating, maybe not enforcing getting to a certain standard, but certainly just being aware of it. If you are going to sell a house and it is a 3-star NATHERS house, well, it is what it is, and the consumer can make a choice about that, right? And if you believe that it's going to add value to your home by upgrading it before you sell it, then go for it. At least we've got some visibility here, and it will hopefully, as you said, keep builders to account going forward, because if there are workarounds going on, there are alternative pathways happening that are shortcutting the point of the system in the NATHERS space to make the future a safer place for all of us, then I think it's something that we should be highlighting on this podcast. So thank you for your time today. I appreciate what's been quite an insightful chat that I'm sure a lot of people in the industry, as I said, from CEO all the way down to first-time buyer, will have a bit of an eye-opening experience understanding, one, how their NATHERS rating was created in the first place, or could be, but two, what's going on in the background right now.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been a good chat.
Thanks, James.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Perth Property Show. If you've only just joined the conversation, you can catch up by heading over to our website, perthpropertyshow.com.au, subscribing to the podcast, or joining our Facebook page. Don't forget to tune in next Monday at 7 a.m. for more expert insights, local analysis, and suburb spotlights. Happy hunting!